Hi to everyone who's watching this. My name's Alex Batchelor. I'm one of the science communication interns working with the Abisko research station this year. And with me today is Professor Terry Callaghan. Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
So I want to start by saying you have had a very extensive career. I was looking you up before the interview and I don't think I could list everything you've done or we wouldn't have time for the interview. But I thought I'd just pick out a few things to comment on that I thought were very exciting and show how much work you have done in the Arctic. So you were a scientific officer with the British Antarctic Survey. You've been a professor of Arctic biology with universities in both the UK and Sweden. You founded the UK NERC Arctic Station on Svalbard. You also founded Interact, which is a network of research stations in the North Atlantic region. You've published over 430 scientific papers. And on top of all that, and much more, you were a director of the Abisko Scientific Research Station. So you've obviously been very busy over your career. But I was hoping we could start with going right back to the beginning, and I wondered if you could tell me what first made you want to be a scientist.
I think being a scientist came second. The first thing is I wanted to work in the natural environment. I grew up in Manchester, in the centre of Manchester, at a time when there were smogs. And in a bad smog, the visibility was down to 2 meters or less, which is absolutely incredible. People don't believe it today, but that's true, 2 meters visibility. And the cars stopped, the trains stopped, the buses stopped, the garden plants were covered in soot, the houses were covered in soot, our clothes were covered in soot. And I just wanted to go to somewhere which was nice, green, and wide spaces, and clean as in clean snow. So I knew from very early on in my life that I wanted to work outside. And then as I progressed further in the education system, then the opportunities became more apparent, because at an early age I didn't know what the opportunities were, and I didn't even know about the sort of job I was doing now until I was a postgraduate.
I completely agree. I can't imagine being trapped in smog. I don't think many people today can, so I can understand wanting to go for the clean outdoor spaces and get to work there. So when you did become a researcher, you did your undergraduate degree, you did a master's and then a PhD, I believe?
Yes.
What was your PhD in, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I think that my PhD was the biggest commute that's possible. I did my PhD on comparing plant growth in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So I commuted from Disco Island, West Greenland, to South Georgia in the sub-Antarctic. And it's very interesting in terms of how science works, that the paradigm then was totally different to the paradigm now. So in my long life, I've seen paradigm shifts in ecology. So my work was very much on trying to understand how plants could survive the harsh, cold conditions at the distributional limits of various plants in the north and the south. And of course now, more than 50 years later, I'm interested in how these plants, the very same plants, survive in a warming climate. So things have changed totally.
That is definitely the longest commute that I think you could possibly have. So, as you said, you started out with as an Arctic plant ecologist. Was there something that particularly drew you to Arctic plants instead of, say, desert ones?
I think it was the opportunity more than anything else. I mean, again, at that stage of my career, I didn't know enough about the plants in the Arctic or the deserts to make an actual choice about which was the best, the most appropriate to work on. But there was an opportunity. There was something called the International Biological Program, a networking organization in the late 60s, early 70s, and they had an opportunity to study in what they call the tundra biome. So then I studied joined that international biological program. And of course, that networking stayed with me today. And we'll go through that later a bit, because that was what attracted me to Abisko, gave me the opportunity to come to Abisko. But the funny side of this is that, of course, I was interested in the way things worked in ecology, not the taxonomy of all the different species. So going to the polar regions where there are very few plants was absolutely perfect for me.
Your researcher profile on the Sheffield University website says that you moved from, solely plant ecology into more ecosystem science, environmental change. And was that sort of again, because of opportunities that arose, or was that a deliberate, wanting to move from one area to another?
No, it was very deliberate. I think that a lot of scientists, sorry, this is a criticism now, but a lot of scientists are trapped in the area that they started off in. And I wanted to learn more about the systems I worked in. And I understood that I could not understand plant growth unless I knew something about the soil, unless I knew something about the animals, unless I knew something about the people. I had to look at the holistic system to understand what was happening to plants. And of course, at the same time, there were different environmental problems, UVB, for example, and then climate change that I couldn't understand how the natural system worked unless I understood those pressures on the natural system. And then it became wider and wider to understand the relationship between animals and plants. I had to understand what's happening to snow, what's happening to permafrost. So I spread out to try to get a holistic approach.
Kind of what I would say is quite a common thing for scientists, although they might not always be able to follow it, is one question leads to another and another, and before you know it, you want to study everything.
Sadly, I mean, the way most science works is that people get more and more detailed questions. So they go into ever and ever minuter details. And I did the opposite. I went into wider and wider areas.
Since I'm with the Abisko research station, the main point of this interview is to ask you about your time there. When did you first visit Abisko?
Almost half a century ago. I first went there in 1972. And when I went in 1972, the director there was someone called Gustav Sandberg. And the station was mainly used for research by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and they owned the station. They owned it when I was there as well. So it was a fairly small operation then. But through the International Biological Program, where I was collaborating already as a PhD student around the world, one of the friends I made was a guy called Matt Sonesson. And we became very, very good friends, and we are extremely good friends to this date. I still visit him every year. So we became very close in terms of friends, and he invited me to the Abisko station. I went back in 1974, and I think from then on I visited almost every year until I retired and developed my research projects with his support and with his help and encouragement.
Would you be able to tell me a bit about the research that you did while you were at Abisko? I assume over 50 years it may have changed quite a bit.
Yes, but the first research I did there was based on clonal plants. And I think, sorry, it sounds boastful, but I think it was actually quite novel. Around the world, a lot of the plants are annual plants, like in Britain, for example. They produce seed one year and then the plant dies, and the next year the seed germinates and produces a new plant. Well, in the Arctic, you have a lot of clonal plants. These are plants that grow, and the individual clones may survive for, well, I think the maximum in the Arctic is about 6,000 years. So we had to look at the plants and the ecology of the plants in a very different way, and we had to understand how these clones worked. So I developed a research program on clonal plant growth, and that involved several PhD students from Britain, from Holland, from Sweden, of course, and different Iceland, who just studied how these plants functioned. And we produced a whole series of papers on that. And then from that, then we later learned that there were global environmental problems like UVB. So I developed work on UVB then, together with Matt Sonesson, the director, and Professor Lars-Olof Björn from Lund University. And we have the reputation of creating the first ecosystem experiment on UVB in the world. And we produced the first papers on UVB effects on ecosystem processes. All the work before, not all, but almost all the work before then was based in greenhouses or growth chambers where you had a very unnatural setting. But our paradigm was to work in the natural environment, and that was a natural laboratory. So the Abisko station, the beauty of it is it's in a beautiful area with very diverse landscapes, very diverse ecosystems. And that is the laboratory. You don't need to bring things inside to work on because you disturb them. And if you've got a clone that's 1,000 years old, then you don't want to break it up into bits to bring it into the laboratory to work on because that's unnatural. So we were working in the field. We applied our UVB in the field. And that was the start of a big process. It was part of the United Nations Environment Programme, which was working in tandem with the Montreal Protocol. So they reported, or we reported, to the Montreal Protocol. And we had a nice meeting of that United Nations panel at Habisco.
That's incredible, you know, being right at the forefront of a new area of research and doing things in a new way that's fantastic.
And it was the same with later with this climate change work. A professor from Copenhagen, he was originally from Gothenburg in Sweden. He was a Swede called Sven Jonasson. And I started an experiment where we were warming. It's a summer warming, a passive warming with simple little tents. But that later became the International Tundra Experiment. And that's in countries all over the world now, Arctic and Antarctic. So that started Abisko too. And then the last thing we did, I think, which was completely novel, was I worked with the indigenous people. So I think I was the first director to actually involve indigenous people at the station and in publications and in research. And we listened to them and they told us that what they were suffering from was extreme weather events. Now, of course, it's not news to anyone now, but go back 12 years and it was new. So we set up the world's first experiment on heating the Arctic environment in winter and burning the snow off for a few days to simulate an extreme event, to find out what the processes were and how quick the recovery would be. And now, again, this has grown all over the world. So people are now realizing the Arctic isn't just greening, it's actually browning because of these extreme events.
Were there any specific challenges you had to overcome since it was an Arctic environment to work in? I mean, you're presumably used to it at this point, having worked in the Arctic and Antarctic.
Yes, I mean, I don't think there were any specific challenges apart from a very low budget. So there's always a lot of work to bring grants in from around the world. But one of the reasons, which is a very important reason actually, why I worked at the Habisco station, was at the time I was working there, it was the finest in the north. It was the finest for most places in the world. And what that meant is that I could invite old senior professors who were not good on their feet or didn't travel very well, and I could invite families to come and work there. Whereas if I was on a typical Arctic station with a little wooden hut and some tents, they wouldn't come. So I could go to Abisko with my family for long periods, in the same way that my friend Matt Sonnerson did with his family as well. And we could live there and survive there. Well, sorry, I'll rephrase that. We could live there very happily. We didn't have to survive. When you do a lot of Arctic research in small Arctic research stations, you have to survive rather than just living. So my family and I, we regarded Abisko as our second home because we spent a lot of time there. And even now, my kids want to take their kids to Abisko because it was a very important part of their childhood.
I'm not surprised. I have seen photos, even though I've not been able to get there this year. It looks beautiful, and I really want to visit at some point, even if it's a holiday. Yeah. Do you think that the permanence of Abisko as a research station, it's been there for over 100 years at this point, and the fact that researchers can live there all year round without being at too much risk, do you think that really promotes the science that's done there to be not necessarily better, but possibly wider in scope?
Wider and better are two different things. It certainly promotes activity, let's put it that way. It promotes activity. The activity it promotes is because people have a good context in which to work in. They have long records in case of the lake ice going back to about 1904 or even earlier. And they have climate records, which are more than 100 years along. So by having that contextual material and knowing what is there, it's much easier to do your new research because you're based within this context. You can compare the modern climate change with old climate change. You can't do that in many places like some of the research stations in Alaska, where they have a relatively short period. So the modern period of warming, we know at Habisco there was a period of warming in the 1900s to 1920s, which was as great as the warming we're seeing now, but then we had a cooling. So we know that this, up until maybe 10 years ago, that what we're seeing now was not unique, and that plants and animals survive that initial warming. You don't know that for other places that don't have the long records. So I would say that the long records from Abisko attracts people. The facilities, and that is not just the fact that the station is open all year round, but that it has power in the field like Stored Island. That's one of the reasons why Stored Island is so well developed, because my predecessor, Matt Sorensen, put power there in the International Biological Program. I re-established it to invite some US projects to work there. And then it built up from there with lots and lots of different projects with really high technology and world-leading technology on the Stored Island mine. All that is just because of you had electricity and facilities there. So those facilities at Abisko certainly do increase all the activities. In terms of excellence of science, that's something different. Excellence of science, I think, is encouraged by the level of activity. So if you have high activity, there's a chance that some of that activity will be excellent. If you have very little activity, there's a small chance that it will be excellent. So I think that by having a lot of activities, you have excellent science. And I think one of the things that I'm proud of for my time at Abisko is that I acted as an ambassador. So I was invited around the world to give talks and to present Abisko. And I went to many conferences and talked about Abisko, and that attracted excellent scientists. I think the best single example I had is I gave a talk in Miami. And as a result, after that talk, someone came and talked to me and said, I'd like to come and just visit Abisko for 2 days and write an article about it. So I said, fine, come. And that was an editor of Nature, the journal Nature. So as a result of my one talk, we had a 2-page spread in Nature about the Abisko station and its activities with no cost. So that, I think, was very important, was not just sitting at Abisko expecting people to come, but inviting lots of people from around the world and going and being an ambassador for Abisko around the world as well. And that led to a lot of excellent things.
I mean, nature is the goal for a lot of scientists, so managing to get someone to do a spread for you is great. So as we mentioned, you were the director of Abisko for 14 years, I believe.
I joined in 1996, and I think I officially retired in 2007.
Wow. So you've when you were the director of Abisko, did that was that alongside your research, or was that sort of like took all of your time?
No, very much alongside the research. I've always refused throughout my life to be an administrator, and even now I'm not an administrator. I'm still working. At 75, but I never wanted to do a lot of administration. And 2 things happened when I started Abisko. One is that I also got to be the coordinator of a brand new research unit called the Climate Impact Research Centre. There were 4 centres set up from regional funding, EU funding and Swedish funding in 1996. One of them survived, and that was ours, the Climate Impact Research Centre. And that it now is a very major organisation at the Abisko station. But what transformed my possibilities was that when I joined, there was a new deputy director appointed, and that was a guy called Christer Jonasson. And we were extremely close friends, and we worked together in a fantastic way until he left Abisko after I did. But in all the years we were together, there was never any tension, not a single cross word. And that's unique in life, I think. But he was there to make sure everything worked smoothly. He worked with the local authorities and often with the academy itself. He was magnificent. He was a fantastic guy and did a huge amount of work. And without him, I couldn't have continued with my research, and I also couldn't have run the Abisko station because I didn't have all the connections with local authorities and so on. So he played an amazing role in the Abisko station.
What are the biggest changes you've seen at the station since you first started going there, and also during your time as director?
Right, well, one I think I've described, and that's the development of the science. And if I can put it into a nutshell, when I first went and Gustav Sandberg was a director, the research was limited to members of the academy. It was very difficult to do any research that wasn't related to the academy. When Mats came there, he brought the International Biological Program with him, and he widened the station. He also developed the facilities. He built a new extension on one of the wings, and he built an accommodation block, which we call House D. And together we built up the science, because we worked together on the new science project and internationalizing the station. When I went there, the first thing, I was just repeating myself, the first thing that happened is we started the Climate Impact Research Centre. So immediately we had a new research centre, and I think at its peak it had 26 scientists in it, whereas the Abisko station only employed, I think it was 2 scientists, because the rest of the people were support staff. So that was a huge development and a huge input. And following that, because the amount of money we got with we then, in my time, we started to develop the facilities further. So, for example, I got a new lecture theatre. The lecture theatre at Abisko was a grant to me from an organisation in Lund. And we got that because I'm a professor, was a professor at Lund University. So I had access to funding in the south of Sweden. So we had a brand new all-purpose lecture theatre with all the equipment, everything, beautiful building. We also put up, we joined the accommodation block to the main building to form a lot of new laboratories for the Climate Impact Research Centre. And then finally, we twisted the arm of the local authority in Kiruna and built a new accommodation block for the new scientists coming to Abisko. So there were major infrastructural developments, as well as the huge increase in science. So very big changes from 1972 when I first went there.
Do you have a particular favourite memory or moment from Abisko that stands out to you? Not necessarily scientific, that could be, you know, people you met or anything really.
I've got lots of memories, and I mean, I can go through personal memories, but I won't, because it's just a beautiful place, and it was very special. Every trip there was very special, and I used to go all through the year, so I saw it in every season, every month of the year. But I think in terms of impact, there are 2 memories that I want to share. One is that I've forgotten the year now, but in one year, the Minister of Environment in Sweden contacted me and said he was hosting a meeting of Ministers of Environment to discuss climate change issues. And he would like to bring them to Abisko, to show them around Abisko, and he'd like talks from me and my staff. So I said, of course, I'm extremely proud and honoured to have this invitation. So I hosted 27 ministers of the environment from around the world and 50 ambassadors who were climate negotiators. And they all came to our new research station, our new lecture theatre, and they listened to what we were doing at Abisko. They went right toward the facilities and the experiments on climate change. They then, I arranged a meeting with the Sami. So I think I was the person that actually built the link between the station and the Sami community. And the best thing I did for them was give them a voice at that meeting so they could express their views on environmental change and what impact it had on their culture to 27 ministers of the environment. So that was, they felt that the Abisko station had given them a platform, and that cemented a relationship that stays to this day. So I think that's the most important memory I have.
Do you have any advice for somebody who's considering a career as a scientist or is early in their career? I mean, I personally am a PhD student at the moment, so yeah. I'm quite early on.
I will answer that, but there's also a topic that I'd like to introduce before you finish the interview.
That's quite all right.
Yeah, so, but answering your question, first of all, it's a very incredibly simple piece of advice. And it's 2 pieces of advice. First of all, think of how you want to spend the rest of your life. Do you want to spend it looking at a computer screen? Do you want to spend it talking to people, traveling? Do you want to spend it in the natural environment? just think of how you want to spend your day. You have to do it, in my case, for 53 years. So it's important that I enjoy my day. So that's the first piece of advice, and that's the advice I give my kids. And when my grandkids are old enough, I'll give them the same advice. And the second advice, which is equally important, is that I chose only to work with nice people. And that is incredibly important too, that there is no point in working with people you can't work with because you don't get anything done. And maybe there's a third one for scientists, and that is only work on questions that can be answered, because you won't make any progress if you work on questions that can't be answered. So those are the three topics I think that I would like to highlight as advice for the future.
I think that's some great advice. Thank you. What would you like to introduce into the interview?
Right. Well, when you introduced me at the beginning, you stopped short of the information on the Sheffield website is very old. So you stopped short of my current activities. You mentioned Interact. That is now 88 research stations, not just the North Atlantic. It's 18 countries. So it's every Arctic country and many others too in alpine regions and regions bordering the Arctic. 88 research stations. So that's a very big operation. We're now a non-profit organisation, so we're both an EU project. We've had EU projects 4 times now, and we're now a non-profit organisation too. And that was all started from Abisko. And Abisko led the other research stations by forming this network. So that was really important, working together throughout the Arctic to understand the big problems. But the other aspect of this is one of science diplomacy. There are big geopolitical tensions in the Arctic. And by hosting scientists at your research station, whether it's Abisko or any other research station, by hosting scientists from different countries, by traveling to different countries and working there, you break down the cultural boundaries and you learn and understand the ways of life of other people, the way they do things. And that has actually influenced ambassadors and politicians. So they practice top-down diplomacy, but by scientists working together and collaborating and helping major problems like to be solved, like climate change and UVB and whatever, they're actually creating a different type of diplomacy, a bottom-up science diplomacy, which is incredibly important. So now most of my work is based in Russia, in Siberia. So I'm a professor there, and I'm also the co-chair of the international board of the 5th biggest, most successful university in Russia. So I'm working as much as I can with Russian colleagues to try to break down some of this stupid tension between the East and the West, but from the bottom up, not from the top down. So this is another aspect of science that's not often talked about, but just the mere process of working together internationally. Like sport, it creates bonds, it creates links, and it diffuses tension.
I hadn't really thought of that before, but I've been to conferences and met people from around the world, so it makes complete sense that will help, get people talking, get people solving problems together instead of being opposed.
Well, when we applied for one of the Interact projects, we had letters of support from ambassadors in different countries. So that is major when an ambassador supports a science project, that they understand the power of science diplomacy.
Do you think that it's important to not only be able to communicate with people on the level of politicians, but also with ordinary people, everyday non-scientists, not politicians, the kind of work that the science communication interns are hopefully part of?
Absolutely, 1000%. And a lot of my life now is spent on building resources for education. I'm the head of, sorry, not the head, that's the wrong word. I'm the patron of a British charity called Wicked Weather Watch, which is providing resources and lessons for primary schools throughout Britain. And we're building lots of resources for the University of Arctic. And we produce a lot of outreach materials in terms of graphic animations of processes, but also books. And I'd advise you to look at one of our books, which was published in 2015. It's called Stories of Arctic Science. And each story is just 2 pages. What did we do? What did we find? Why are the results important? Very, very simple. About 500 words and a lot of beautiful pictures. and it's all written in language which is easy to understand. And that book has gone to prime ministers and presidents and decision makers who can actually implement changes. So it's really important to get to them. Also, school teachers use them and the general public use them as well. And this year, at this moment, in fact, that we're producing the next version, the 2020 version. And I spent this morning on a conference call taking that further. We have 40 new stories on breaking Arctic science. That everyone is just a few words and some pictures for the general public. So we try to communicate with everyone. And I'll let you into a little secret, which won't make me popular, but scientists in general, have real problems in communicating. So we've had to rewrite almost every story. They can't count either. So we asked for, I think it was 350 words. We got more than 2,000 in some cases. Because scientists are so enthusiastic and so into their project that they want to explore it, they want to explain it, they want to give information, but very often they don't give it in the right way and they turn people off rather than turning the public on. So yes, I'm absolutely convinced about the need for better science communication, absolutely.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I think that's everything I have to ask you, unless there's something you'd like to add.
No, I think I added what I needed to add.
And once again, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed today.
You're welcome. It would be nice to see the final edited version.